In the sleepy coastal town of Pine Harbor, Maine, a 90-year-old man was about to teach a ruthless motorcycle gang a lesson they'd never forget. Daniel, old Dan Sullivan, appeared to be just another elderly regular at the Harbor View Cafe, until the day the Iron Wolves made the mistake of taunting him during his morning coffee. What the feared motorcycle gang didn't know was that this gentle-looking old man was one of Korea's most legendary Marine Force Recon commanders, with over 100 successful behind-enemy lines missions and the Congressional Medal of Honor to prove it. The Harbor View Cafe stood as a testament to time itself, its weathered clapboard exterior painted the same soft blue it had worn for over 50 years. Perched on the edge of Maine's rocky coastline, it offered patrons a sweeping view of the working harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the morning tide. The cafe had been Dan Sullivan's second home since he'd settled in Pine Harbor after his retirement from the Marines, drawn to the quiet dignity of this hard-working coastal community. The morning sun was just beginning to burn away the harbor mist as Dan's old Ford pickup rolled into his usual parking spot. His movements were deliberate but graceful as he emerged from the truck, his ramrod-straight posture betraying his military background to anyone who knew what to look for. The small Marine Corps pin on his worn denim jacket caught the early light, a modest testament to years of extraordinary service that he never spoke about. Inside, the cafe hummed with its usual morning rhythm. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the salt air drifting in through open windows, while the gentle clatter of plates and murmur of conversation created a comfortable backdrop that had helped ease Dan's transition from military to civilian life all those years ago. Mary, the owner's daughter, looked up from behind the counter with a warm smile. She'd grown up watching Dan solve his crossword puzzles in that corner booth, his quiet presence a constant in her life since childhood. "Morning, Mr. Sullivan," she called out, already reaching for his usual coffee cup. "Dad just pulled a fresh batch of blueberry muffins from the oven. They're your favorite, made with wild Maine berries from up the coast." Dan settled into his corner booth, the leather worn smooth from years of loyal patronage. From this vantage point, he could see both the harbor and the cafe's entrance. Old habits died hard, even after decades of peace. "Just coffee for now, Mary," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite reconnaissance teams deep behind enemy lines in Korea. The regulars were all in their usual spots. Tom Mackenzie, the harbor master, nursing his third cup of coffee while reviewing tide charts. Sarah Chen, the town's veterinarian, grabbing a quick breakfast before her morning rounds. And old Pete Williams, who'd served in the Navy during Vietnam, exchanging friendly nods with Dan as he had every morning for the past 20 years. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the cafe's worn hardwood floors, highlighting the framed black and white photographs that lined the walls, snapshots of Pine Harbor's history, including one faded image of Dan in his Marine dress blues, standing proud and tall during the ceremony where he received his Medal of Honor. Before we continue with this incredible story of courage and respect, we'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, and if you enjoy these kinds of remarkable true stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got another amazing story coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. The peaceful scene at Harbor View Cafe was about to shatter, though none of the regulars could have predicted how this ordinary autumn morning would transform their quiet town forever. Through the cafe's wide windows, the first rays of sunlight sparkled on the harbor's surface, fishing boats heading out for their morning catch while seabirds wheeled overhead. It was the kind of quiet morning that had drawn Dan to Pine Harbor in the first place, a place where a man could find peace after years of combat and sacrifice. Later, people would say they heard the motorcycles before they saw them. The low rumble carried across the water, out of place among the familiar sounds of boat engines and seagulls. The noise grew louder, more menacing, until it filled the morning air with a thunderous growl that made coffee cups rattle on their saucers. The Iron Wolves were about to make their presence known in Pine Harbor, but they were about to learn a powerful lesson about true strength and earned respect. What was about to unfold in this small coastal cafe would become the stuff of local legend, a story about how wisdom and courage can triumph over intimidation and force. It would remind everyone in Pine Harbor that sometimes the quietest among us carry the most remarkable stories, and that true strength often comes in the most unexpected packages. Dan Sullivan was about to prove that even at 90 years old, a Marine never forgets his training. and that some battles can be won without firing a shot. The Medal of Honor hanging in a simple frame on his living room wall told only part of his story. The rest was about to unfold in ways that would change Pine Harbor forever. The Iron Wolves arrived like thunder, their motorcycles roaring into the Harborview Cafe's parking lot in a practiced formation that spoke of organized intimidation. 8 bikes lined up with military precision, though these men had never served a day in uniform. Their chrome gleamed in the morning sun, weapons of intimidation rather than tools of transportation. The leader, a mountain of a man known only as Razor, cut off his engine last, the sudden silence somehow more threatening than the noise had been. Mary's hand trembled slightly as she refilled Dan's coffee cup, her eyes darting nervously to the window. The Iron Wolves' reputation had preceded them up the coast. 3 towns over, they'd already established their presence through a campaign of systematic intimidation. Businesses there now paid protection money, and any resistance had been met with swift and violent consequences. The stories of broken windows, mysterious fires, and beaten shopkeepers had traveled fast along the coastal communities. "It's all right, Mary," Dan said quietly, his weathered hand steady as he lifted his coffee cup. "Why don't you go help your father in the kitchen for a bit?" His voice carried the same calm authority he'd used decades ago to steady young Marines under enemy fire. Mary nodded gratefully, disappearing through the swinging kitchen doors just as the cafe's entrance chimed. Razor entered first, having to turn sideways to fit his massive frame through the doorway. His leather vest bore patches that told stories of violence. Territory claimed, rivals defeated, laws broken. The patches were arranged with the same attention to detail that Dan had once seen in military decorations, though these spoke of a darker kind of service. Behind him filed in 6 more Iron Wolves, each carrying themselves with the swaggering confidence of men used to taking what they wanted. The 8th member remained outside, keeping watch, a detail Dan's combat-trained mind automatically registered. The morning regulars tried to make themselves invisible. Tom Mackenzie suddenly found his tide charts fascinating, while Sarah Chen quietly gathered her things, leaving cash on her table as she planned her escape. Only old Pete Williams stayed put, his Navy veteran's instincts keeping him alert to what was about to unfold. His right hand unconsciously touched the Navy anchor tattoo on his forearm, a gesture Dan recognized as a warrior's reflex. "Well, well," Razor's voice carried across the now silent cafe. "What a quaint little place we've found ourselves." His boots thudded heavily against the hardwood floor as he approached Dan's corner booth. The sound reminded Dan of mortar fire, a rhythmic threat growing closer. "Mind if we join you, old-timer? Seems like you've got the best seat in the house." Dan didn't look up from his crossword puzzle. "Free country," he replied evenly. "At least it was last time I checked. Men fought and died to keep it that way." His pencil moved steadily across the puzzle squares, each letter as precise as when he'd filed mission reports in Korea. One of the younger gang members, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, snorted derisively. "Hey, Razor, check this out. Gramps here's got himself a Marine pin. Probably bought it at some Army surplus store." The young man's ignorance of what that pin truly represented would soon come back to haunt him. Razor slid into the booth across from Dan, uninvited. 2 more Iron Wolves pulled up chairs, blocking any easy escape route. The remaining gang members spread throughout the cafe, making their presence felt. Through the kitchen window, Mary's father watched with growing concern, his hand reaching for the phone, though he didn't yet know who to call. "So, Marine." Razor leaned forward, his massive arms spreading across the booth's backrest. "You've been in Pine Harbor a while, haven't you? Seen lots of changes, I bet." His tone was conversational, but the threat underneath was clear as breaking glass. "Well, more changes are coming. Pine Harbor's about to enter the 21st century, if you catch my meaning." Dan calmly filled in another crossword answer. 7 letters. Unwelcome visitors. Starts with T. He looked up finally, meeting Razor's gaze. "Trouble, I believe, is the word I'm looking for." The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, the same expression he'd worn before leading his men into particularly dangerous missions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The snake-tattooed man stepped forward aggressively, but Razor held up a hand, his eyes narrowing as he studied Dan more carefully. There was something in the old Marine's calm that didn't fit with the usual pattern of intimidation. Most people showed fear by now, but Dan Sullivan's hand remained steady as he lifted his coffee cup, his blue eyes clear and alert as they had been decades ago in Korea. "You know," Razor continued, his voice dropping lower, "running a business in these uncertain times can be dangerous. Accidents happen, windows break, fires start, all sorts of unfortunate things. But the Iron Wolves, we're like an insurance policy. A small weekly payment and businesses don't have to worry about such accidents." The morning sun had fully cleared the harbor now, streaming through the cafe's windows and highlighting the faded photograph of Dan receiving his Medal of Honor. None of the Iron Wolves had noticed it yet, just as they hadn't truly noticed the careful way the old Marine was observing their positions, logging their movements, assessing threats just as he had done countless times in combat. "That's an interesting business model," Dan replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Razor pause. "But Pine Harbor already has insurance and protection." He turned to the next clue in his crossword. "Besides, I'd hate to see you boys make a mistake you'd regret." Razor's face darkened at the implied challenge. Behind him, the snake-tattooed man cracked his knuckles meaningfully. The tension in the cafe had reached a breaking point, the morning silence broken only by the distant cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of harbor waves. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Harbor View Cafe, but the future of Pine Harbor itself. Razor's hand shot out, knocking Dan's coffee cup off the table. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed through the cafe like a gunshot. Coffee spread across the worn hardwood floor, dark and accusing. The remaining customers froze, their breath caught in their throats as they waited to see how the old Marine would react. Dan Sullivan didn't flinch. He carefully folded his newspaper and set it aside, his movements as measured as they had been during countless covert operations behind enemy lines in Korea. "That was unnecessary," he said quietly. "Mary takes pride in those cups. Some of them have been here since her grandfather opened this place." "Cups can be replaced," Razor sneered, leaning forward. "Bones, on the other hand." He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. The snake-tattooed man moved closer, eager for action, while the other Iron Wolves spread out further, blocking the cafe's exits. Through the kitchen door, Mary watched with wide eyes as her father continued his whispered phone conversation. "You know what I see when I look at you boys?" Dan's voice remained steady, his eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. "I see children playing at being soldiers, wearing your little patches, marking your territory like dogs." He shook his head slowly. "I've known real warriors. Led them. Buried them. You're not fit to shine their boots." The snake-tattooed man lunged forward, but before he could reach Dan, old Pete Williams's voice cut through the tension. "I'd think carefully about your next move, son." Pete hadn't moved from his seat, but his coffee cup now sat forgotten. "That Marine pin you were mocking? It was awarded to Force Recon commanders, special operations, the kind of men who did things that never made it into any history books." Razor's eyes narrowed as he studied Dan more carefully. "Force Recon? In Korea?" For the first time, a hint of uncertainty crept into his voice. One didn't survive long in the outlaw biker world without learning to read threats, and something about the old Marine's calm was setting off warning bells. "Razor," one of the older Iron Wolves spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Look at the wall." He pointed to the faded photograph of Dan receiving his Medal of Honor. In the image, a younger Daniel Sullivan stood ramrod straight in his dress blues, his chest decorated with medals that told stories of extraordinary courage. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted subtly. The Iron Wolves might have been criminals, but they weren't stupid. Force Recon commanders didn't earn their positions by being easy targets, even decades after their service. And the Medal of Honor, that spoke of something else entirely. "Tell me something, son," Dan said to Razor, his voice taking on the tone he'd once used to instruct young Marines. "Do you know what it takes to earn a Medal of Honor?" The citation for mine mentions a 4-day operation behind enemy lines. Our mission was compromised. We were surrounded, outnumbered 20-1. I lost good men during those 4 days, but we completed the mission. Got the intelligence that saved an entire division from ambush. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. But that's not why they gave me the medal. They gave it to me for what happened on the 5th day, when I went back in, alone, because I'd promised those boys I'd bring them home to their mothers, one way or another. The morning sun streaming through the cafe windows caught the small Marine Corps pin on Dan's jacket, making it gleam like a star. Some of the younger Iron Wolves shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they were in the presence of something they didn't fully understand. So, when you talk about accidents and protection, Dan continued, his voice hardening slightly, remember this. I've faced down armies, lost brothers, carried the bodies of 19-year-old kids through enemy territory because I made them a promise. You really want to test what promises I might make today? Razor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound made several of his men jump. You're just one old man, he growled, but the earlier confidence had leaked from his voice like air from a punctured tire. Dan smiled then, the kind of smile that had once made enemy commanders reconsider their positions. Am I? He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, pulling out an old flip phone. You boys ever hear of the Marine Force Recon Association? Interesting thing about Marines, we keep in touch, stay organized, and we're always ready to honor our oaths to protect and serve. His thumb hovered over the keypad. Now, I've got a choice to make. I can call some old friends who'd love nothing better than to remind the world why you don't mess with Marines, or you boys can walk out of here, get on your bikes, and find another town to terrorize. One that doesn't have a Force Recon commander enjoying his morning coffee. The tension in the cafe had reached a crescendo. Through the windows, the peaceful harbor scene continued unchanged, boats bobbing gently, seagulls wheeling overhead, completely unaware of the war room the quiet cafe had become. The next few moments would determine whether Pine Harbor's future would be written in peace or violence, and it all hinged on a 90-year-old Marine with a flip phone and a lifetime of combat experience in his steady hands. The flip phone in Dan's weathered hand suddenly seemed more threatening than any weapon. Razor's eyes fixed on it, calculating odds and outcomes with the instinct of a predator who suddenly realized he might be prey. The morning sun streaming through Harborview Cafe's windows cast long shadows across the worn floor, like battle lines being drawn in silence. You're bluffing, old man, Razor growled, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that his fellow Iron Wolves had never heard before. This isn't the military. Your war buddies aren't going to ride in here like the cavalry. Dan's thumb moved deliberately across the keypad, each button pressed deliberate and meaningful. 2nd Battalion, Force Recon, he said quietly, almost to himself. We had a motto. Silent, swift, deadly. These days most of us are retired, running businesses, living quiet lives. His blue eyes met Razor's. But we never stopped being Marines. The snake-tattooed man shifted nervously. Boss, maybe we should... Razor silenced him with a glare, but the damage was done. The first crack in their intimidating facade had appeared. Another Iron Wolf, older and seemingly more experienced, stepped back slightly, his eyes darting between the door and the Medal of Honor photograph. Let me tell you about Marines, Dan continued, his voice taking on the tone of a veteran sharing hard-earned wisdom. We're not like other services. There's no such thing as an ex-Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine. And Force Recon? We're a special breed, the ones they sent in when regular forces couldn't get the job done. The ones who operated so deep behind enemy lines that if something went wrong, there wouldn't even be a body to send home. Through the kitchen window, Mary and her father watched in tense silence, the phone in her father's hand still connected to local law enforcement. But somehow, they knew this situation required a different kind of authority. In all the years they'd known Dan Sullivan, they'd never seen this side of him, the commander emerging from beneath the quiet exterior of their regular customer. You've got 3 seconds to put that phone down, Razor threatened, his massive frame looming over the table. Or we show this town what real violence looks like. his hand clenched into a fist the size of a small ham, leather gloves creaking with the tension. Dan's response was to press another button on his phone. The sound seemed to echo through the suddenly silent cafe. "You know what the hardest part of command was?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of decades of service. "Not the fighting, not even watching good men die. It was knowing that every decision you made could cost someone their life. That's the kind of responsibility that changes a person." He looked up at Razor, his eyes sharp with combat-hardened focus. "Right now, you've got the same kind of decision to make. Whatever happens next, it's on you. Just like Korea was on me. Just like every mission, every firefight, every time I had to decide whether to risk my men to save others." Old Pete Williams spoke up from his corner, his voice carrying the authority of another veteran who understood. "Force Recon reunions are something to see," he said casually, but his eyes were steel. Hundreds of combat veterans, most of them still in fighting shape. They do this thing where they can mobilize faster than any official military response. Something about keeping their skills sharp. Something about never leaving a brother behind. Dan's thumb hovered over the final button. "The Iron Wolves aren't the first gang to try claiming territory up here. Last bunch ran into some resistance. Local chapter of veteran bikers. Funny thing about veteran bikers, they tend to respond real quick when one of their own calls for help. Real quick and real decisive." The morning light caught the Medal of Honor in the framed photograph, drawing every eye in the room. The significance of what that medal represented, extraordinary courage, leadership, and sacrifice, seemed to fill the cafe like a physical presence. In the image, young Dan Sullivan stood proud and tall, but those who knew what to look for could see the weight of command in his eyes, the same weight that showed now as he faced down a different kind of enemy. "Last chance, son," Dan said quietly. "Walk away now, and we pretend this never happened. Stay, and you'll learn why Force Recon's reputation kept enemy commanders awake at night, why we were the ones they warned their men about around their campfires." Razor's face twisted with conflicting emotions: rage at being challenged, fear of the unknown threat, and the dawning realization that he might have finally pushed too far. The other Iron Wolves looked to their leader, waiting for a decision that would determine far more than just this morning's outcome. The phone in Dan's hand started to beep as his thumb pressed the final numbers of a sequence he'd memorized decades ago. Each tone seemed to increase the tension in the room, like a countdown to something inevitable. The sound carried clearly in the silent cafe, each beep another nail in the coffin of the Iron Wolves' intimidation tactics. "Those numbers I just dialed?" Dan's voice remained steady. "They connect to a special frequency. Within 5 minutes, every former Force Recon Marine within 100 miles will know there's a situation in Pine Harbor. Within 10 minutes, they'll be on their bikes. Within 30 minutes. He let the implications hang in the air. Mary's father had emerged from the kitchen now, standing behind the counter with quiet dignity. The rest of the cafe's patrons remained frozen, watching history unfold in their quiet coastal town. The gentle lapping of harbor waves against the dock outside seemed to mark time like a military drummer, each second bringing them closer to a point of no return. Dan's finger moved to the send button, his eyes never leaving Razor's face. In that moment, combat veterans present could feel the weight of command settling over the old Marine once more, as natural as breathing. The next few seconds would determine not just the fate of Harborview Cafe, but the future of Pine Harbor itself. And it all hinged on whether a gang leader could swallow his pride before a 90-year-old Marine showed him what real power looked like. The send button clicked with a finality that seemed to echo through the Harborview Cafe. Dan Sullivan held the phone to his ear, his posture straight as it had been decades ago when calling in air support during desperate moments in Korea. The cafe had fallen so silent that everyone could hear the phone ringing on the other end, each tone like a countdown to something inevitable. "Colonel James Morrison," a gruff voice answered on the third ring. Dan's expression didn't change, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. The same subtle tell his men had once learned meant the tide of battle was about to turn. "Jim, it's Dan Sullivan." His voice carried the same calm authority he'd used when directing reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. "Remember that talk we had about keeping Pine Harbor safe?" He paused, letting his old friend process the implications. "Well, I've got 8 uninvited guests at Harborview Cafe who need a lesson in respect." Through the phone came the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine roaring to life. 10 minutes, Morrison replied simply. "Keep them there." The line went dead, but the echo of that revving engine seemed to hang in the air like a promise. Razor's face had lost some of its color, though he struggled to maintain his intimidating facade. The older Iron Wolf who had noticed the Medal of Honor photo earlier took another step back, bumping into a table. The clink of disturbed coffee cups made several gang members jump, their nerves suddenly on edge. "You just made a big mistake, old man," Razor snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The snake-tattooed man had stopped his aggressive posturing, his eyes now darting between Dan and the cafe's exits, like a cornered animal seeking escape. "Interesting thing about Force Recon veterans," Dan continued as if Razor hadn't spoken, carefully returning his phone to his jacket pocket. "We understand territory, strategy, the importance of rapid response." He picked up his crossword puzzle again, the gesture so casual it was almost insulting. "Right now, there are at least 30 former Force Recon Marines within riding distance of Pine Harbor. Did you know that, son? 30 men who've seen more combat than your whole gang combined." Old Pete Williams shifted in his seat, a knowing smile crossing his weathered face. "Might be more than that, Dan. Heard some of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion boys retired up here recently, the ones who served in Desert Storm." The morning sun continued its climb over Pine Harbor, its rays now reaching deeper into the cafe, illuminating dust motes that danced in the tension-filled air. Through the windows, the first signs of movement could be seen along the waterfront as the town began its daily routine, unaware of the war room the quiet cafe had become. "You're lying," the snake-tattooed man declared, but his voice cracked slightly. "This is all a bluff. No way that many veterans just happened to be." The distant roar of motorcycles cut him off mid-sentence. This wasn't the chaotic rumble of the Iron Wolves' arrival. This was different. A synchronized, disciplined sound that spoke of military precision and coordinated movement. Dan recognized it immediately, the approach formation of Marine veterans who'd never forgotten their training. "First wave," Dan commented mildly, filling in another crossword answer. "Probably the locals. The others will take a bit longer to arrive." He glanced up at Razor. "Though I should warn you, Force Recon Marines tend to travel fast when one of their own calls for help." Mary had emerged from the kitchen again, drawn by the approaching sound. Her father stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both watching through the windows as the first motorcycles appeared at the end of the street. These weren't the gaudy, chrome-laden machines the Iron Wolves rode. These were serious bikes for serious riders, their engines tuned for performance rather than show. "Last chance," Dan offered, his voice carrying the weight of command. "You can walk out of here now, get on your bikes and find somewhere else to cause trouble. Or you can stay and explain yourselves to some very motivated Marines who've been looking for a good reason to remind people why you don't mess with one of our own." The lead bike pulled into the cafe's parking lot, followed by 3 more. Their riders dismounted with military precision, their movements carrying the unmistakable discipline of combat veterans. Through the window, everyone could see the Marine Corps emblems on their leather vests, along with combat ribbons that had been earned the hard way. "Your choice, son," Dan continued, looking directly at Razor. "But you should know something about Force Recon Marines. We're trained to complete the mission, whatever it takes. Right now, their mission is responding to my call. And unlike your gang's patches and territories, their commitment to this mission was earned in places most people can't find on a map, fighting battles that never made the headlines." The cafe's door chimed as the first veteran entered. Colonel James Morrison stood tall despite his 60-plus years, his presence filling the room with the quiet authority of a man who had led others in combat. His eyes took in the scene with tactical precision, noting positions, threats, and advantages just as he had done in countless combat situations. The Iron Wolves were about to learn why the Marine Corps motto Semper Fidelis, always faithful, wasn't just words on a poster. It was a promise, written in blood and honored through generations of warriors who understood that true strength came not from intimidation, but from the unbreakable bonds forged in service to something greater than themselves. The 2nd Battalion veterans rolled into Pine Harbor like an incoming tide, their bikes moving in perfect formation down the narrow coastal streets. Leading them was Master Sergeant Mike "Iron Mike" Rodriguez, his silver hair visible beneath his helmet, as he guided his motorcycle into a precise position blocking the cafe's parking lot exit. The Iron Wolves' escape route had just been cut off with tactical precision that spoke of decades of military experience. Razor's hand twitched toward his jacket, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the cafe. 3 Marines instantly shifted their positions, their movements subtle, but purposeful. They weren't drawing weapons. They didn't need to. Their combat experience had taught them that presence and positioning could be more effective than any show of force. "I wouldn't," Morrison advised calmly, noting Razor's aborted gesture. "Whatever you're thinking about reaching for, son, just remember, you're in a room with men who've disarmed enemy combatants with their bare hands, men who've survived firefights that lasted days, not minutes. You really want to escalate this situation?" Through the cafe windows, more veterans could be seen dismounting their bikes. Each movement was coordinated, practiced, the kind of efficiency that came from years of military discipline. Their leather vests told stories of service across generations: Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different wars, different eras, but united by the same core principles of honor, courage, and commitment. "This is our territory," Razor growled, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. The snake-tattooed man had backed completely away from Dan's booth now, nearly pressing himself against the far wall. Other Iron Wolves were eyeing the doors and windows, calculating odds that grew worse with each passing minute. Dan Sullivan's voice cut through the tension like a well-honed blade. "Territory?" He shook his head slowly. "Son, let me tell you about territory. I once spent 6 days behind enemy lines in Korea, holding a hilltop with 12 Marines against an entire battalion. We were surrounded, outgunned, running low on ammunition. Know why we held that position?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Because those 12 Marines understood something you boys never will. Territory isn't about who can intimidate the most people. It's about who's willing to stand and fight for what's right. Those Marines held that hill because they'd sworn an oath to protect others, not to bully them." Iron Mike Rodriguez had entered the cafe now, removing his riding gloves with deliberate care. His forearms bore the scars of combat, and his eyes carried the steady gaze of a man who had seen the worst humanity could offer and hadn't blinked. "Got 73 veterans out there now, Colonel," he reported to Morrison, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism of a senior NCO. "Mix of Force Recon, regular Marine units, some Army Special Forces. Even got a couple of SEALs who were in the area." He smiled slightly. "Word travels fast when someone threatens one of our own." Mary had moved to refill Dan's coffee cup, her hand steady now as she poured from a fresh pot. The simple act seemed to emphasize how the power dynamic had shifted, from the Iron Wolves' attempted intimidation to this display of community solidarity. "You know what's interesting about veteran bikers?" Morrison addressed the Iron Wolves, his tone almost conversational. "We're not in it for the patches or the territory. Most of us started riding because it helped with the transition back to civilian life, the focus required, the brotherhood of the road. It's familiar, comfortable, helps keep the memories at bay." He gestured to the growing crowd outside. "Every man out there has faced real combat, real danger. They've lost friends, buried brothers, carried wounds both visible and hidden, and every single one of them dropped whatever they were doing this morning because a fellow Marine needed help." The sound of more motorcycles approaching filled the air, but this time, even Razor didn't try to maintain his tough facade. The Iron Wolves' reputation for violence, which had seemed so impressive in a small coastal town, now felt hollow in the face of men who had faced down armies. "Last chance," Dan said quietly, sipping his fresh coffee. "Walk away now. Find somewhere else to cause trouble, because if you stay..." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but every veteran in the room understood the implications. Old Pete Williams shifted in his seat, his Navy tattoo visible as he crossed his arms. "Reminds me of something my commanding officer used to say. There's a difference between acting tough and being strong. These boys are about to learn that difference the hard way if they don't wise up quick." Outside, the gathered veterans had formed a perfect perimeter around the cafe. Their bikes gleamed in the late morning sun, not with the gaudy chrome of the Iron Wolves' machines, but with the well-maintained pride of men who understood that true power comes from discipline and purpose, not flash and intimidation. The moment stretched like a drawn bow, tension filling the Harbor View Cafe as Razor faced a choice that would determine not just the immediate future, but the fate of his entire gang. In his eyes, you could see the desperate calculations, the growing realization that he had pushed too far, challenged the wrong people, and was now facing men who had spent their lives preparing for moments exactly like this. Razor's decision came with the suddenness of a breaking storm. His massive frame straightened as he took one step back from Dan's booth, his leather vest creaking with the movement. The sound seemed to echo through the tension-filled cafe like a crack in ice, a warning of imminent collapse. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the beads of sweat now forming on his forehead. "This isn't over, old man," he snarled, but the threat in his voice rang hollow against the backdrop of assembled combat veterans. "Pine Harbor isn't as protected as you think. We've got friends in other places, connections you military types wouldn't understand. The Iron Wolves are bigger than just this town." Colonel Morrison's laugh was sharp and without humor. "Connections? Son, let me educate you about connections." He pulled out his own phone, holding it up like evidence in a court-martial. "Right now, I've got calls coming in from veteran chapters in 3 states, men who've served in every conflict from Korea to Afghanistan. You think your gang networks can match decades of military brotherhood? We've got members in law enforcement, federal agencies, and every level of government." The snake-tattooed man had already begun edging toward the door, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. 2 other Iron Wolves followed his lead, their movements betraying a nervous energy that hadn't been present during their dramatic entrance. Their boots scuffed against the hardwood floor, each step taking them closer to what they hoped was safety. "You're making a mistake," Razor continued, though his eyes darted between the various veterans now positioned strategically around the cafe. "The Iron Wolves don't forget. We don't forgive. This town will learn." "Let me stop you right there," Dan interrupted, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used to command troops in combat. "Before you finish that threat, there's something you should know." He gestured to Iron Mike Rodriguez, who pulled out a thick manila envelope, its contents clearly substantial. "See, while you boys were playing at being intimidating," Dan continued, "my friends here have been doing what Force Recon does best, gathering intelligence. That envelope contains photographs, names, addresses. Every illegal operation your gang's been running up and down the coast, every protection racket, every drug deal, every act of violence. We know about the warehouse in Portsmouth, the distribution network in Portland, even your connections to the Montreal suppliers." Morrison took up the thread smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Those files are now in the hands of federal authorities, state police, and every veteran motorcycle club in the Northeast. One phone call, and it all goes public. Your entire operation exposed. Every safe house, every route, every corrupt official on your payroll, all of it comes crashing down." The color drained from Razor's face as the implications sank in. The Iron Wolves had always operated in the shadows, using fear to keep victims quiet. But they'd never faced opponents who understood real strategic warfare, who knew how to gather intelligence and use it as a weapon more effective than any show of force. Outside, more veterans had arrived, their bikes now filling not just the cafe's parking lot, but spilling onto the surrounding streets. The morning sun glinted off their leather vests, highlighting combat ribbons and unit patches that told stories of battles fought and won across decades of service. Each veteran stood with the quiet confidence that came from facing real danger and emerging victorious. "You've got exactly 1 chance," Morrison declared, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "Leave Pine Harbor. Never come back. If we hear about your gang causing trouble in any other towns, these files go public. If you try to retaliate against anyone in this community, and I mean anyone, the files go public. If you so much as look at Pine Harbor on a map, everything we know becomes headline news." Mary's father had emerged from the kitchen again, standing behind the counter with newfound confidence. Around the cafe, other patrons who had been cowering in fear now sat straighter, watching justice unfold in real time. The transformation from victims to witnesses was visible in their faces, their postures, their steady gazes. "Think carefully about your next move," Dan advised, lifting his coffee cup with deliberate casualness. "Because right now, you're surrounded by men who've made a career out of eliminating threats. Men who understand that sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemy realize they can't possibly win. Men who've faced down armies and come out on top." One of the older Iron Wolves, the one who'd first noticed Dan's Medal of Honor photo, suddenly pulled off his gang colors. The leather vest hit the floor with a symbolic thud that echoed through the silent cafe. "I'm out," he announced, his voice carrying a note of finality. "This isn't what I signed up for." He looked at Razor. Fighting local shops is one thing. Taking on the entire United States Marine Corps, that's suicide. You've led us into a war we can't win. The gesture seemed to break something in the gang's unified front. 2 more members stripped off their colors, backing away from their leader. The snake-tattooed man was already halfway to the door, his earlier tough guy persona completely abandoned, replaced by the real fear of someone who finally understood the depth of their mistake. Through the cafe's windows, the gathering of veterans had taken on an almost ceremonial appearance. Bikes arranged in perfect formation, riders standing at parade rest, a display of disciplined power that made the Iron Wolves' attempts at intimidation look childish by comparison. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. True strength versus hollow threats, earned respect versus demanded fear. "Time's up," Morrison announced, checking his watch with deliberate precision. "Make your choice. Walk out of here under your own power, or learn firsthand why Marine Force Recon's reputation kept enemy generals awake at night." Razor's face twisted through a series of emotions: rage, fear, humiliation, and finally, resignation. His shoulders slumped slightly, the first real crack in his intimidating facade. The mighty leader of the Iron Wolves was beginning to understand what real power looked like, and it had nothing to do with leather vests or gang patches. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring, the entire cafe holding its breath as Razor faced the most important decision of his life. Behind him, his remaining gang members waited to see if their leader would choose wisdom or destruction. The answer would determine not just their fate, but the future of every town the Iron Wolves had terrorized. Razor's decision manifested in stages, like a fortress slowly crumbling under siege. First, his shoulders dropped their aggressive stance. Then, his clenched fists gradually loosened at his sides. Finally, the mask of intimidation he'd worn for so long slipped completely, revealing the face of a man who suddenly realized he was hopelessly outmatched. "This is how it ends?" he asked, his voice barely carrying across the now silent cafe. The question seemed directed not at anyone in particular, but at the universe itself. Everything we built, everything we controlled, taken down by one old man's phone call? Dan Sullivan set his coffee cup down carefully, the gentle clink against the saucer somehow emphasizing the gravity of the moment. "No, son, this is how it begins. The beginning of you understanding what real strength looks like, what true brotherhood means." Through the cafe's windows, the gathering of veterans had grown even larger. Word had spread through the veteran community like wildfire, drawing more retired service members to Pine Harbor with each passing minute. Their bikes now lined both sides of the street, a physical representation of the unbreakable bonds forged in combat. "Your problem," Colonel Morrison said, stepping closer to Razor, "is that you confused fear with respect. You thought terrorizing shopkeepers and threatening civilians made you powerful. But look around this room. Every veteran here has faced real enemies, real danger. We've seen what true courage looks like, and son, it's not found in breaking windows or demanding protection money." The snake-tattooed man had finally reached the door, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the handle. Outside, 3 Marine veterans shifted their positions slightly, their movements subtle but precise. The message was clear. Leaving wouldn't be as simple as walking out. "The Iron Wolves have territory up and down the coast." Razor attempted one last show of defiance, though his voice lacked conviction. "You can't protect every town. You can't be everywhere." Iron Mike Rodriguez stepped forward, the morning sun catching the combat ribbons on his vest. Actually, we can. See, that's the thing about veterans. We're already everywhere. Police departments, fire stations, local government. Hell, half the businesses you've been threatening are probably owned by veterans. You just never noticed, because real warriors don't need to advertise their strength. Mary's father moved from behind the counter, standing tall beside Dan's booth. I served too, he said quietly, speaking up for the first time. 4th Infantry Division, Vietnam. Never mentioned it because I didn't think it mattered anymore. But watching you threaten my daughter, my customers, my town. He shook his head slowly. It matters now. One by one, other patrons began to stand. The hardware store owner by the window, former Army Rangers. The elderly woman who ran the bookshop next door, Navy intelligence. Even young Jimmy from the gas station, recently returned from Afghanistan. Pine Harbor's quiet surface had concealed a core of steel that the Iron Wolves had never suspected. Here's what's going to happen, Dan said, his voice carrying the same authority that had once commanded elite reconnaissance teams. You're going to walk out of here. Take your bikes and your gang and your threats. Leave Pine Harbor and every other town you've terrorized. Because if you don't, if you try to maintain your grip on any of these communities, that envelope of evidence goes public. Morrison added, and while you're deciding your next move, remember this. Every veteran motorcycle club in 3 states now knows about the Iron Wolves. They're watching, waiting. One phone call from any of us and your entire operation comes crashing down. The remaining Iron Wolves who hadn't already removed their colors were now looking at their leader with growing uncertainty. The gang's aura of invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the dawning realization that they were small fish who'd accidentally wandered into very deep waters. Last chance, Dan said softly, but his voice carried to every corner of the suddenly silent cafe. Make the right choice, son. There's no shame in admitting you're beaten, not when you're facing opponents who've spent lifetimes preparing for moments exactly like this. Razor's hand moved slowly to his vest, fingers gripping the leather. For a moment, tension crackled through the room. Would this be another threat? Another attempt at intimidation? But then, with a motion that seemed to physically pain him, he pulled the vest off. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the floor was like a final hammerfall, marking the end of the Iron Wolves' reign of terror. We're done here, Razor announced, his voice hollow with defeat. Pine Harbor's yours. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Dan. You know this changes everything, right? Other gangs will hear about this. They'll know the Iron Wolves backed down. Dan's response was calm, but carried the weight of decades of combat experience. Good. Let them hear. Let them know that some towns aren't worth the trouble, that some people won't be intimidated, that true strength isn't found in causing fear, but in standing together against it. The morning sun had reached its zenith, streaming through the cafe's windows and illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where history was being made. The Iron Wolves' attempt to claim Pine Harbor had failed, not through violence or force, but through the quiet strength of a community united, led by a 90-year-old veteran who understood that some battles are won with wisdom, rather than weapons. The departure of the Iron Wolves from Harborview Cafe carried none of the swagger or intimidation of their arrival. One by one, they filed out, several leaving their colors behind on the cafe floor like shed snakeskins. The morning sun cast their shadows long and diminished across the weathered hardwood as they walked away from their failed attempt at dominance. Razor was the last to leave, his massive frame somehow smaller without his leather vest. At the door, he paused, turning back to face Dan Sullivan one final time. You know something, old man? In all our time running territories, nobody ever stood up to us like this. Not one person. That's because you never understood what real strength looks like, Dan replied, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through combat and sacrifice. You confused fear with respect, intimidation with power. Easy mistake to make, until you meet men who faced down armies and lived to tell about it. Outside, the gathered veterans maintained their disciplined presence, forming an honor guard of sorts as the defeated gang members walked to their bikes. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. The Iron Wolves' gaudy machines parked haphazardly against the precise formation of veteran-owned motorcycles that now lined the street. Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his combat-hardened eyes tracking each departing gang member. "Remember what we said. This isn't just about Pine Harbor. You try to set up shop anywhere else, threaten any other communities, and those files go public. We've got eyes everywhere, and we're watching." The sound of the Iron Wolves' motorcycles starting up lacked the threatening rumble of their arrival. As they pulled away from the cafe, their formation was scattered, disorganized, a physical manifestation of their broken power. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, carrying with it the last vestiges of their reign of intimidation. Mary began gathering the discarded gang vests from the floor, but Dan raised a hand to stop her. "Leave them for now," he said quietly. "They're evidence. Proof that sometimes the biggest victories come not from fighting, but from showing your opponent that fighting isn't worth the cost." The gathered veterans began to relax their positions, though their tactical awareness never fully disappeared. Old habits forged in combat die hard. Iron Mike Rodriguez pulled up a chair at Dan's booth, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Just like old times, eh? Though I've got to say, this was a lot cleaner than some of the operations we ran back in the day." Through the cafe windows, Pine Harbor seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Shopkeepers who had been watching nervously from their doorways began to emerge. Pedestrians who had hurried past now stopped to stare at the gathering of veterans' motorcycles, understanding that something momentous had just occurred in their quiet coastal town. "You know this isn't really over," Morrison said, taking a seat across from Dan. "Word will spread. Other gangs might see Pine Harbor as a challenge now, something to prove themselves against." Dan nodded slowly, lifting his coffee cup. "Let them come. They'll find the same thing the Iron Wolves did, a community united, protected by men and women who've sworn an oath to defend others. Some lessons need to be taught more than once." Mary's father emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "On the house today, gentlemen," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "For all of you. Small thanks for saving our town, but it's what we can offer." Old Pete Williams stood up, his Navy tattoo visible as he rolled up his sleeves. "Saving the town is one thing, keeping it safe is another. Might be time we formalized some sort of veterans presence here in Pine Harbor. Show any other troublemakers that this town's got permanent protection." The suggestion rippled through the gathered veterans like a tactical plan taking shape. Morrison nodded thoughtfully, years of strategic planning evident in his expression. "Could work. Set up a legitimate veterans motorcycle club. Coordinate with other chapters up and down the coast. Create a network of protection that doesn't rely on fear or intimidation." Dan's eyes met Mary's as she began cleaning up the broken coffee cup from earlier, the one Razor had knocked over in what now seemed like a different lifetime. "What do you think, Mary? Ready to have a bunch of old warriors as regular customers?" Her smile was bright with relief and gratitude. "Mr. Sullivan, after what you all did today, Harborview Cafe is your home base for as long as you want it. Besides, someone needs to keep you supplied with coffee and crossword puzzles." Through the cafe's windows, the morning sun continued its arc across the sky, illuminating a Pine Harbor that had been fundamentally changed. Not by violence or force, but by the quiet strength of a 90-year-old veteran who understood that true power comes not from causing fear, but from standing against it. The gathered veterans began sharing stories, their laughter and conversation filling the cafe with a different kind of strength. One built on brotherhood, sacrifice, and the unshakable bonds forged in service to something greater than themselves. The Iron Wolves had sought to rule through intimidation, never understanding that real power had been quietly residing in Pine Harbor all along, waiting for the moment when it needed to make itself known. As evening approached, Harborview Cafe had become the birthplace of something unprecedented. Veterans from across New England continued to arrive, each bringing their own stories of communities threatened by gangs like the Iron Wolves. The maps on the tables now bore more markers, identifying not just trouble spots but also veteran-owned businesses, potential safe houses, and coordination points. Latest count puts us at over 200 veterans ready to join the Coastal Guardian Alliance, Morrison reported, updating the growing list of names. Everything from Vietnam-era Force Recon to fresh-out-of-service Afghanistan veterans. Plus, we've got contacts in law enforcement, emergency services, and local government. Dan Sullivan studied the evolving network taking shape on the maps before him. His tactical mind, honed by years of planning reconnaissance missions, could see the strategic advantages of their approach. "We're not just creating a response team," he observed. "We're building a prevention network, eyes and ears in every town, ready to spot trouble before it takes root." Mary had transformed the cafe's back room into an impromptu operations center, setting up boards where veterans could coordinate their efforts. The discarded Iron Wolves vests still hung on the wall, but now they were surrounded by military unit patches, campaign ribbons, and service medals, symbols of real strength freely given in service to others. "Got confirmation from the state police," Iron Mike announced, ending another call. "They're officially recognizing the Coastal Guardian Alliance as a legitimate community protection organization. We'll have direct lines of communication with law enforcement, complete information sharing." Old Pete Williams returned from a meeting with local business owners, his face bright with purpose. Every shop on Main Street wants to participate. They're offering their businesses as safe havens, coordination points. The hardware stores even donating space for a permanent headquarters. Through the cafe's windows, the evening sun painted the harbor in shades of gold and purple. The gathered motorcycles gleamed in the fading light, no longer just vehicles, but symbols of a new kind of protection, one based on earned respect rather than enforced fear. "We need to make something clear," Dan said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded elite reconnaissance teams. "This isn't about revenge or territory. We're not replacing one form of control with another. This is about protection, about giving communities the strength to stand up for themselves." Morrison nodded, understanding the deeper wisdom in those words. "Already thought of that. Every member of the Alliance will be vetted, not just their service records, but their character. We're looking for guardians, not warriors. Men and women who understand that true strength comes from preventing violence, not causing it." A young Marine veteran fresh from Afghanistan spoke up from near the window. "Sir, we've got offers of support from veteran-owned businesses all along the coast. Everything from garages for our bikes to safe houses for people needing protection from gang threats. The network's growing faster than we imagined." Dan's eyes met Mary's as she brought him a fresh cup of coffee. In her face, he could see the transformation that had come over Pine Harbor. Fear replaced by confidence, isolation replaced by unity. The Iron Wolves had tried to rule through intimidation, never understanding that they were actually uniting the very forces that would ensure their defeat. "We're establishing training programs," Iron Mike added, spreading out a new set of documents. "Teaching business owners and community members how to spot trouble, how to report it safely, how to support each other." The Iron Wolves relied on keeping people scared and isolated. We're doing the opposite, building connections, creating strength through unity. As if to emphasize his words, more veterans arrived outside the cafe. The rumble of their motorcycles carried none of the threatening undertones of gang bikes. Instead, it sounded like thunder rolling in to clear the air after a storm. Each new arrival brought additional resources, additional skills, additional commitment to protecting their coastal communities. "You've started something remarkable here, Dan," Morrison observed quietly. "One phone call this morning, and you've catalyzed a movement that could change everything. These gangs have been moving up the coast for years, thinking they could just take whatever they wanted. Now they'll face something they've never encountered: organized, disciplined resistance from men and women who've faced real war." Through the cafe's windows, Pine Harbor's evening activities continued undisturbed. Fishing boats returned to the harbor, shopkeepers prepared to close for the day, families walked along the waterfront. But there was a new confidence in their movements, a sense of security born from knowing they were no longer alone. "The Iron Wolves thought they could own these towns through fear," Dan said, his voice carrying the weight of lessons learned in combat. "Instead, they've helped us create something that will protect these communities for generations. Sometimes the best victories come not from winning fights, but from making sure they never have to happen." As darkness settled over Pine Harbor, the Harbor View Cafe glowed like a beacon of hope. Inside, veterans continued their planning, building not just a response to gang threats, but a legacy of protection that would ensure no community would have to face intimidation alone again. The Coastal Guardian Alliance was taking shape, born from one old Marine's refusal to back down, growing into something that would change the face of coastal New England forever. Word of what happened in Pine Harbor spread like wildfire along the New England coast. Within 24 hours of the Iron Wolves' departure, reports began flowing in from other communities. In Portsmouth, gang members who'd been running protection rackets suddenly disappeared overnight. In Portland, mysterious warehouse operations packed up and vanished. The Iron Wolves' entire network was collapsing like a house of cards in a storm. Harborview Cafe had remained open through the night, serving as the command center for the newly formed Coastal Guardian Alliance. Dan Sullivan sat in his usual booth, now surrounded by maps, reports, and the steady stream of veterans still arriving to join their cause. The morning sun found him exactly where the previous day's confrontation had begun, though now he was orchestrating something far larger than just one town's defense. "Just got word from our contacts in law enforcement," Morrison reported, setting down his phone. "The Iron Wolves aren't just leaving Pine Harbor, they're abandoning their entire territory. Seems our little show of force convinced them that maintaining control here wasn't worth the risk." Iron Mike Rodriguez entered the cafe, bringing the crisp morning air with him. "Better than that, Colonel. Got confirmation that 3 other gangs operating along the coast are pulling out too. Word spreading about what happened here. None of them want to risk facing an organized veteran response." Mary moved among the gathered veterans, distributing fresh coffee and breakfast. The cafe had transformed overnight, its walls now covered with maps marking safe zones, veteran-owned businesses, and potential trouble spots. The discarded Iron Wolves vests still hung behind the counter, but now they were flanked by service medals, unit patches, and photos of veterans who'd pledged to protect their communities. "It's not just about the gangs leaving," Dan observed, his tactical mind seeing the bigger picture. "Look at what's happening in town." He gestured toward the windows, where Pine Harbor was coming alive with renewed energy. Shop owners who'd kept their heads down for months now walked with confidence. Neighbors stopped to chat on street corners. The fear that had gripped the community was being replaced by something stronger: unity. Old Pete Williams arrived with a stack of newspapers from up and down the coast. "We're making headlines," he announced, spreading them across the table. "Veterans unite to protect coastal communities. Gang influence crumbles as military veterans organize. New Guardian Alliance brings hope to troubled towns." "This is bigger than we initially planned," Morrison said, studying the coverage. "We're not just creating a local response team anymore. We're building a model that other communities can follow. Already got calls from veteran groups in other states asking how they can set up similar networks." Through the cafe windows, more motorcycles arrived. Not gang bikes, but the disciplined machines of veterans answering the call to serve once again. Each new arrival brought additional resources, skills, and commitment to the cause. The parking lot had become a sea of bikes, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun like badges of honor. "The key difference," Dan explained to a group of newly arrived veterans, "is that we're not fighting for territory or control. We're standing up for communities, giving them the strength to resist intimidation. Every business owner who can walk without fear, every family that feels safe in their home. That's our real victory." Mary's father emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Got calls from 3 other cafes along the coast," he reported. "They want to set up as safe havens, coordination points for veteran patrols. People are ready to take their communities back." The morning light streamed through Harborview Cafe's windows, illuminating the gathered veterans as they continued their planning. Maps were marked, communications networks established, protocols developed. What had started as one old Marine's stand against bullies was evolving into something that could change the face of coastal New England. "Latest count puts us at over 300 veterans signed up," Iron Mike announced, updating their roster. "Got everyone from Korean War vets to fresh out of service Afghanistan veterans. Plus, we're getting support from active duty personnel on leave, reserve units, even some retired law enforcement." Dan studied the growing network taking shape on the maps before him. His years of planning reconnaissance missions had taught him to look for patterns, to see the strategic implications of every move. "We're not just pushing out the gangs," he observed. "We're changing the entire dynamic. These communities aren't just being protected, they're learning to protect themselves." Outside, Pine Harbor had come alive with activity. Shop owners chatted with veteran patrols, sharing information and building connections. Families walked the streets without fear, nodding gratefully to the men and women who'd stepped forward to protect their town. The Harborview Cafe had become more than just a local gathering spot. It was now a symbol of resistance, resilience, and the power of united communities. "You know what impresses me most?" Morrison said quietly to Dan. "It's not just that we drove out the Iron Wolves, it's that we did it without firing a shot, without throwing a single punch. We showed these communities that real strength isn't about violence, it's about standing together against intimidation." The morning sun continued its climb over Pine Harbor, casting long shadows from the gathered motorcycles. Each shadow seemed to reach toward the future, promising protection, unity, and a new kind of strength born from the wisdom of warriors who understood that the greatest victories often come without violence. 1 month after the Iron Wolves' departure, Pine Harbor had undergone a transformation that went far beyond the absence of gang intimidation. The Harborview Cafe remained the heart of the Coastal Guardian Alliance, but its role had evolved. The maps and tactical plans had been replaced by community bulletins and patrol schedules. Veterans still gathered there, but now they came not just to plan protection strategies, but to share stories, mentor young people, and strengthen the bonds that held their coastal communities together. Dan Sullivan sat in his familiar booth, watching the morning light play across the harbor waters. His daily crossword puzzle lay untouched beside his coffee cup as he observed the changes in his town. Where once shopkeepers had hurried nervously between destinations, they now walked with confidence, greeting the veteran patrols like old friends. "Morning, Captain Sullivan," called a young voice. Jimmy from the gas station, now proudly wearing his Marine Corps veteran pin, stopped by the booth. "Thought you'd like to know. We just got word that 2 more towns up the coast have started their own Guardian chapters. The network's growing faster than we can keep up with." Mary approached with fresh coffee, her smile bright with the confidence that had replaced her former fear. The cafe walls told the story of Pine Harbor's transformation. The Iron Wolves' discarded vests now served as a backdrop for photographs of veteran community partnerships, newspaper clippings about successful protection programs, and maps showing the expanding reach of the Guardian Alliance. "Got some interesting news," Colonel Morrison announced, sliding into the booth across from Dan. "Remember that intel package we had on the Iron Wolves operations? Turns out we didn't need it. They've completely disbanded, not just here, but all along the coast. Our success in Pine Harbor started a domino effect." Through the cafe's windows, the morning revealed a town reclaiming its soul. The hardware store, once a target of gang intimidation, now hosted weekly veterans meetings. The bookshop had started a program where veterans shared their stories with local youth, teaching lessons about courage, service, and standing up for what's right. "It's not just about protection anymore," Dan observed, his voice carrying the wisdom of a man who'd seen both war and peace. "Look at what's happening. We're building something entirely new. These communities aren't just safer, they're stronger, more united. The Iron Wolves thought they could rule through fear, but they ended up teaching us the power of standing together." Old Pete Williams entered, accompanied by several other veterans who'd been instrumental in establishing the Guardian Alliance. "Just finished our morning patrol," he reported. "You know what's remarkable? We're seeing more American flags going up on porches, more people sitting out on their stoops in the evening. It's like the whole town's coming out of hiding." Iron Mike Rodriguez arrived with a stack of applications, more veterans wanting to join the Alliance. "Got requests from 3 other states now," he said, spreading the papers on the table. "They want to know how to set up their own Guardian chapters. This thing we started here, it's becoming a movement." The morning sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the gathered veterans. Each one carried stories of combat, of sacrifice, of service to something greater than themselves. But now they were writing a new chapter, one about protecting home, about turning military experience into community strength. "You know what I love most?" Mary said, pausing at Dan's booth. "It's not just that we drove out the gang. It's how this place has changed. The cafe used to be just somewhere people came to eat. Now it's a gathering place, a symbol of community. People come here to feel safe, to connect, to belong. Outside, more veterans arrived on their motorcycles, the disciplined rumble of their engines now a welcome sound in Pine Harbor. Children who had once hidden from the Iron Wolves' bikes now waved at the Guardian patrols, some dreaming of following in their protectors' footsteps. Got word from the state police, Morrison shared, checking his phone. Gang activity along the entire coast is down 90%. Turns out most of these groups aren't interested in operating in areas where they might face organized veteran resistance. They're looking for easy targets, and we've made it clear these communities won't be victimized. Dan smiled, finally picking up his crossword puzzle. You know what we really did? He asked, his eyes scanning the clues. We reminded people that true strength isn't about causing fear. It's about standing together against it. These gangs thought they could own these towns through intimidation. Instead, they taught us how powerful we can be when we unite. The Harborview Cafe had become more than just a local eatery. It was a symbol of transformation, a testament to the power of community, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting battles, but from showing others how to prevent them. The Medal of Honor on the wall caught the morning light, its gold surface gleaming like a beacon of hope for other communities facing similar challenges. One phone call, Morrison mused, shaking his head in wonder. One 90-year-old Marine decided he'd had enough, made one phone call and changed everything. They'll be telling this story for generations, Dan. Dan's response was typically modest. The story isn't about me, he said, filling in a crossword answer. It's about what happens when people remember their own strength, when they realize that true power isn't in causing fear, but in standing together against it. That's the real legacy of what happened here. 6 months after the Iron Wolves' departure, Pine Harbor hosted a ceremony that nobody could have imagined half a year earlier. The town square, once a place people hurried through in fear, was now filled with hundreds of community members gathered to witness something remarkable. Veterans from across New England had arrived to dedicate a new memorial, not to war or conflict, but to the power of community and courage. Dan Sullivan sat in a place of honor, his Medal of Honor gleaming on his chest in the bright autumn sun. At 90 years old, he remained as straight-backed as he'd been in Korea, his eyes sharp as they surveyed the gathering. The Harborview Cafe, its windows overlooking the ceremony, had been decorated with American flags and Marine Corps emblems, a testament to its role in Pine Harbor's transformation. "Look at this," Colonel Morrison said softly, standing beside Dan's chair. 6 months ago, these people were afraid to walk their own streets. Now look at them. The square was filled with families, business owners, and veterans, all united in a way that would have seemed impossible when the Iron Wolves ruled through fear. Mary approached with a fresh cup of coffee for Dan, just as she had that fateful morning half a year ago. But now she moved with confidence, her smile bright and unreserved. The cafe had become famous up and down the coast, not just as the birthplace of the Coastal Guardian Alliance, but as a symbol of what communities could achieve when they stood together. "Latest reports are in," Iron Mike Rodriguez announced, joining them with a tablet in hand. The Guardian Alliance now has chapters in 67 coastal communities across 5 states. Gang activity in protected areas is down 95%. We're not just driving them out. We're changing the whole dynamic of how communities defend themselves. The memorial they were about to dedicate was simple but powerful, a bronze plaque mounted on a granite boulder brought from Korea, bearing words that Dan himself had chosen. Strength through unity, peace through understanding. Around the memorial, the square had been transformed into a gathering place, with benches where veterans could share their stories with young people, teaching lessons about courage that went far beyond battlefield valor. "You know what makes this really special?" Old Pete Williams observed, his Navy tattoo visible as he gestured toward the gathered crowd. "Look at how many young veterans are here. Afghanistan, Iraq, they're finding purpose again, using their military experience to protect their communities. You didn't just drive out a gang, Dan. You showed them how to keep serving in a different way." The ceremony began with the presentation of colors by a joint honor guard of veterans from all services. The flags caught the autumn breeze, snapping smartly as the crowd rose to their feet. Mayor Thompson, who months ago had been powerless against gang intimidation, stepped to the podium with newfound confidence. 6 months ago, our town lived in fear, she began, her voice carrying across the hushed square. We watched as criminals claimed our streets, threatened our businesses, and tried to break our spirit. Then one morning, a 90-year-old Marine veteran sat in his usual booth at Harbor View Cafe and decided enough was enough. With one phone call, he reminded us what real strength looks like. Dan listened quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap. Around him, other veterans stood tall, their presence a reminder that true power comes not from causing fear, but from standing against it. The Iron Wolves vests, still hanging in the cafe as a reminder, seemed like relics from a distant past. But this memorial isn't just about driving out those who would threaten us, the mayor continued. It's about what we learned in the process. That real strength lies not in intimidation, but in unity. That true courage isn't about causing fear, but about standing together against it. That sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting battles, but from preventing them. As the mayor spoke, Dan's eyes swept across the gathered faces. He saw Mary and her father, standing proud and unafraid. Jimmy from the gas station, now mentoring younger veterans. Shop owners who had once paid protection money, now contributing to community defense funds. Children who no longer hid from the sound of motorcycles, because now those engines meant protection, not threat. When it was Dan's turn to speak, he rose slowly but steadily, his posture still carrying the discipline of a Marine Force Recon commander. The crowd fell silent, eager to hear from the man whose quiet courage had changed everything. You know, in Korea, I learned something important about strength, he began, his voice clear and strong. It's not about who can cause the most fear. It's about who can stand the strongest against it. The Iron Wolves thought they could own these towns through intimidation. Instead, they taught us how powerful we are when we stand together. The autumn sun caught the Medal of Honor on his chest, sending gleams of light across the gathered crowd. In that moment, Pine Harbor understood that they weren't just celebrating the departure of a gang, they were witnessing the birth of a legacy that would protect their community for generations to come. Remember this, Dan concluded, his words carrying the weight of both warrior and protector. True strength isn't found in causing others to fear you. It's found in giving others the courage to stand beside you. That's not just a lesson for Pine Harbor. It's a lesson for every community facing intimidation. Stand together, stay strong, and never forget that the greatest power lies not in the fist that strikes, but in the hands that join in protection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.